wish we were chasing waterfalls somewhere in North Carolina. And I wish I was holding your hand while your hand was holding mine.
Welcome from Tailwaters Fly Company. We're excited to bring you our first piece of long-form content, and today we'll be discussing periodical cicadas with my friend and expert, Matt Reilly. We hope you enjoy and get something out of it. Now, without further ado, on to our discussion with Matt. So you've got John with Tailwaters Fly Company, and we have Matt Reilly with us, periodical cicada extraordinaire. How long have you been fishing the periodical cicada hatch, and how long have you been guiding it?
That's a good question. So 2013 was my first experience with periodical cicadas. I was in high school, back in Central Virginia, where I grew up, and brood 2, which is, they call it the Great Eastern brood, hits a lot of Central Virginia, is, runs right through there. And it, I honestly cannot remember if I was familiar with the bugs or the concept before that, but, it was just sort of like an interruption of my, kind of late spring, early summer farm pond river fishing. Just, I was not aware that it was going to happen, just kind of came out of nowhere. And, got me really excited. I started guiding in 2018. And so I've been fishing periodical cicadas with clients basically since I started guiding. So we had a brood, that was, I'll say semi-local, which just means that within a 6 or 7 hour drive where I can fairly easily set up shop and, attract some of my pre-existing clients. I've been doing that since I started. So we had a brood in 2020. It was brood 9. And then of course we had big brood 10 in 2021. And then last year in 2024, we had, brood 19. And, I've taken clients and fished all of those. So it's been something that I've done since the beginning.
Nice. Do you remember the first fish you caught during a periodical cicada hatch?
Yeah, so actually it was a panfish, which, I've since pretty much moved entirely away from, not because I don't like panfish. I love pan fishing, but where I grew up in Fluvanna County, Virginia, with lots of farm ponds, and that was sort of a primary focus of mine, kind of late May, early June. We'd have these big pumpkin seeds that would get on nests, and you'd catch them on poppers. And, I was just in the midst of doing that when we had all these bugs coming out and landing on the water. And I've got a couple of really old videos of, bugs sitting on the water and getting eaten by bass and sunfish. And it was just, sort of a exclamation point on the fishing I was already doing, topwater fishing that time of year. But it definitely kind of clued me in.
Awesome. And I know the periodical cicada hatch is one of your core guide offerings, and as we'll get to later, it's not easy, and it's probably a hard thing to guide for. So why do you love it so much and enough to pursue it?
Man, I had this experience early on. I've been really lucky to have a lot of very regular, very good clients from the very beginning, that I've fished with several times a year. And the first big hatch that we had, after I started guiding, it was 2021. And, I could kind of feel it out with folks in the boat while we're smallmouth fishing and asking, would you be interested in this? It's pretty dang cool. I'll be setting up shop here in a couple of months. And most of these folks were coming, potentially traveling 9, 10 hours to sight fish smallmouth bass with topwater flies. And I got a surprising number of no's from folks like that were, and my response is like, well, dude, I mean, you like catching a 3 or 4 or 5 pound fish on a topwater fly. What about dozens of 5 to 50 pound fish on topwater flies? And, it's just kind of like, but a lot of those folks after that season saw some photos and videos and things that I'd put out, and it was a kind of a total reversal of attitude. So I think it's a little bit hard to sell to some folks, surprisingly. It's a little bit hard to describe. Um, but it's overstimulating. And when it's good, it's amazing. And, the environment that you're in is loud. It's sort of an alien experience. Um, and then it's just the ability to sight fish large fish on the surface, which, I've described it to a lot of folks as some of the best dry fly fishing in the world when it's going on. Um, and I'm also, I mean, my nickname as a kid is Bug. I've been a bug nerd for my entire life. Um, and more than that, just kind of love research and scouting and adventure and going to new places and, just kind of relying on myself to kind of figure things out and get things done. And so periodical skate hatches just kind of check all those boxes for me, if I'm being honest. It's
Well,
kind of living life at its full potential.
that's actually a great lead into my next question. So, until recently, I feel like information, at least within the fly fishing industry and genre, on periodical cicadas has been pretty hard to come by. You had to really dig in deep and do some technical work. And obviously, Dave Zielinski's book is a great resource for anyone who hasn't heard about it. But
Mhm.
how did you get up the learning curve? Because it seems like a difficult process.
Um, yeah, I mean, I would say, I guess it seems that way. Like all fishing, success comes when you can understand the food source, which in this case are periodical cicadas, which are extremely interesting. So it's not much of a chore learning about them. You got to understand the environment that you're trying to pursue this event in, and then the target fish species and how they all jive and intersect. And so in that sense, I don't, I would say good information's pretty like there's a lot of it out there if you're not relying on, things within the fly fishing genre. The periodical cicadas are incredibly interesting animals, and they've been studied pretty extensively. Um, and just sort of applying knowledge of their biology to a potential fishing situation is how you do that. Um, like a lot of fishing too, it pays to know what you're looking at. So having fished several emergences and seen a lot of different situations, um, if I show up somewhere in mid-May, late May during a periodical cicada emergence, um, I generally can survey the environment and kind of have a decent idea of what I'm looking at, how far along the bugs are, what the fish are doing, how long it'll be before the fish are doing what, et cetera. So, I mean, some of it is just experience, I guess. But a lot of it, honestly, is just book research and um, understanding the progression and exactly how the bugs operate.
Interesting. And have you had to read many like technical research papers or pretty dense biology textbooks?
Not really. I mean, there's a few of them out there. There's lots of there's like University of Connecticut's a big one that has a lot of periodical cicada research. University of Maryland that does a lot too. Um, I've actually got a client that's um, a entomology professor at NC State. So, people like that I've talked to and I've got questions. Um, but there's, like I said, there's periodical cicadas they have sort of a cult following even outside of fishing.
Hmm.
And so there are lots of sort of, you know, just casual naturalists or bug lovers or nature lovers that keep tabs on these things. I mean, lots of folks use the Cicada Mania website. Cicada Safari is sort of a um, citizen science internet-based reporting platform. Um, I would love to know how many folks that use those resources are fishermen, and I think they're the vast minority. Um, but yeah, I mean, folks are just fascinated with them because they're just, like I said, it's kind of an alien experience. A lot of folks, you know, especially if you don't travel much, you haven't moved around the country a lot. I mean, you can live in a place for 16 years and not see one, and then all of a sudden your hometown is swarming with these giant red-eyed orange and black bugs, and it's just interesting, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm going to take a stab at describing some key aspects of their life, and then feel free to jump in with anything. But I just thought it would be helpful for people without a lot of periodical cicada context.
Mhm.
So obviously there's 13 and 17-year broods. They basically live their entire life underground within a few feet of the tree that they were born in. They're terrestrials, so their natural life cycle really has nothing to do with water. We just kind of look for places where it happens to kind of coincide.
Yeah.
And then emergences are kind of triggered by soil temperature. A lot of times that's kind of late April, early, mid, late May, depending on where you're at. And then once they've hatched, males kind of call out to the females as part of the mating process, and females fly to them. And as fishermen, we kind of hope that they land clumsily in the water and get eaten by a big carp. But is there anything else that you would say is kind of essential in understanding the hatch as kind of a foundation?
Um, in terms of like I said, I kind of think in a similar way when it comes to fishing, sort of the pre-spawn and spawn period, um, for smallmouth, where every day, you're waiting for this event to occur, and it doesn't all happen at once, and behavior is going to be largely dependent on where you are in that progression. Knowing what you're looking at is really important. So, um, you know, you can, and it's such a short window of time. It's very easy to show up to a place too early, and it's very easy to show up to a place too late. Um, Bugs, when they start hatching, are usually pretty quiet for a couple of days. You can show up to an area that you expect there to be cicadas hatching out of, and might not hear anything. There might be thousands of them in the trees, but you'll be able to tell based on these small, like pencil width sized holes in the ground where the nymphs have burrowed out. Um, you'll usually be able to see exoskeletons clinging to tree trunks and fence posts and leaves. And they undergo what's called a teneral period, which a lot of insects go through, which is a lot of sort of insects that undergo complete metamorphosis. Um, they have to essentially wait for their exoskeletons to harden, for their wings to harden, so that they can fly around and they can use their adult bodies. So there's usually a couple of days where things are just pretty quiet, and then they'll start singing, and it'll start off pretty quiet, and it'll get louder and louder and louder. And even then, they're usually not flying around too much. And of course, for any kind of fishing to occur, they've got to fly because they've got to end up in the water in large numbers. Um, so there's usually about a week to 10-day period, kind of depending on the weather and how active those bugs are and how quickly they mature. That there's not much fishing. So it's important to understand that when you're showing up to places looking for things. And a lot of folks fall into that trap where they're coming out like crazy in the backyard and they just book it to their closest river or lake or whatever. And, it's just a lake and just a river, you know, and that's just a timing issue. So understanding that kind of early portion of their adult stage is, I think, important in, hitting everything right.
Mhm. So we're just about to start our 2025 cicada season, and with all that context, and we can keep this as high level as you want. I'm not looking for names of water bodies, but where do you start your research process, and kind of how do you narrow in?
When do I start it?
When or how?
Yeah. I mean, you can start whenever you want. The cicada broods are almost like moon phases. You know them pretty far in advance, because they're on a 13 or 17-year cycle. And there is such a thing as stragglers, which are just bugs that come out ahead or behind their sort of scheduled emergence. But for the most part, you can predict the hatch year for individual broods for hundreds of years in the future, as long as climate change doesn't push them to mature faster or slower. But yeah, I mean, I oftentimes am so amped up by the end of a periodical cicada emergence that I already have plans for the next one.
Have you already booked out
And
2030?
so yeah, yeah. So you can plan as far out as you want. Um, the I generally start with the brood and the year, and then the geographic range that's associated with that brood. They're fairly well defined. Like I said, they're an interesting bug. People are really excited to tell you about them when they see them popping up in their town. So there's been a lot of reporting, and there's lots of good maps and things like that. Um, so just identify when they're going to emerge and understand where they're likely to emerge, and then familiarize yourself with the life history and go from there. Um, the um, sort of qualifier there that I've been telling a lot of folks here lately, um, we do have a lot of great reporting citizen science type platforms these days, like iNaturalist, and Cicada Safari is the one that's specific to periodical cicadas. But um we that stuff is relatively new. The internet is relatively new, if you ask brood 14 cicadas, because two emergences ago the internet had like just become a thing. um so while there are great maps, I'm not going to say that they're flawed. But in a lot of cases, there is some missing information, or, um, there's some sort of, I don't want to say false data, but, um, you can draw some conclusions that aren't true by looking at maps that say this large 10 county area is all highlighted on the map, but there may only be a few in each county, for that
Mhm.
whole area, where other smaller areas are more densely populated. And so, you know, I I'll just start with that range, and just kind of look for look for bodies of water and, go from there. There is an element of just kind of having to wait for it to start, before you can really know anything, unless, and that's, it's kind of laughable in the moment, but I mean, I have been fishing these things for more than 10 years, which means by the next semi-local emergence, I will have pretty much fished all of them. So, after you've done that, you know where to go and generally what to expect. So yeah, that's where I'd say if you don't know anything, just consult maps, understand which brood it is, and go from there.
Nice, nice. And once you've kind of once you've narrowed in on an area, how narrow are you getting, and how flexible are you trying to be? Are you picking one corner of one lake and going and sitting there and waiting for the cicadas, or what's your kind of on the ground game plan?
Yeah. Um, well, so usually I go into it with a long list of hunches. I'll pretty much identify every possibility. Because, like you said earlier, it's not is water has almost nothing to do with the life cycle of these bugs. So they are not, it's not even guaranteed that they will emerge around water. So, you have to find places that are within that range that will offer fishing, um, and kind of check them off. So sometimes I'll have a list of 20 possible places. And when things start going, I'll try to, use local information if it's local to me, or if I have experience with it. Um, or, I'll talk to people that live in the area and ask them what they saw 13, 17 years ago. Um, and then as things are kind of developing, it's, you're working a network, talking to friends, customers, that live in some of those areas. And, sometimes my top 5 hunches are all viable, and it's pretty much as simple as that. And sometimes I end up working down my list in the moment, scouting before I find something good. And, you do have to be flexible with that about that. You can't be stubborn. You can't say, well, we're halfway through the emergence, so they just haven't gotten here yet. If they're coming out, and they're out everywhere else around you and they're not there, then they're not coming. Because they don't really arrive. They've been there their entire lives. They're just popping out of the ground and becoming visible. Um, so generally speaking, I'm pretty confident. And as far as like how narrow, when you look at these maps, um, there's a lot of talk of counties. Like Cicada Mania lists a lot of counties relative to
Mhm.
each brood. Cicadas do not observe political boundaries, and so when a resource says Carter County, Tennessee is going to see bugs, that may mean the whole county and some of the surrounding counties, but it could also mean like 5 acres of woods. And 17 years ago, somebody just happened to see them and report it, and it's made its way onto the list. So, you have to be open to that possibility. Um, and like I said, you have to put boots on the ground. You have to go look, and you have to go see for yourself, um, and react. A lot of it's just reacting.
Mhm. Mhm. So we've talked a bit about space. How about time? When do you start putting boots on the ground and doing some of your reconnaissance? And does it vary based on how far north or south you are, or elevation, or anything like that?
Yeah, so since ground temperature triggers the emergence largely, like you said earlier, 64.5 degrees, 8 inches under the surface is generally understood to be the beginning. Timing is incredibly the timing is incredibly weather dependent, and it happens in the spring, so it's highly variable. Um, and how quickly the bugs progress through their adult life stage is also dependent on weather and temperature and all that. years that are warm early can see pretty early starts to emergences. Years that are, stay cold and wet well into April and May can see some later starts to emergences. And then, again, it's all temperature related. Elevation and latitude affect the timing in the same way. Hatches of fish north of the Mason-Dixon line sometimes extend well into late June or early July and might not really get off the ground until late May. And in the South, the Southeast where we live, often it's over by mid-June. So you just kind of you have to understand that and, look at the right time. Like I said, it's very easy to be too early and it's easy to be too late. So, um, I sort of generally know what to expect at this point based on where I am or where I'm planning to fish. And, certain places have, several different localities and extension offices and stuff actually have ground temperature data online sort of real time. So there's resources there too, but that'll give you a kind of an idea of what the timing should look like.
That's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, even once the bugs are out, temperature and weather can have a large effect too. Once cool, wet weather can kind of slow them down. That temporal period can take a little bit longer. Hot, dry weather can speed things up. They'll just be really, really active. They're terrestrial insects, so the warmer it is, the drier and brighter it is. Generally, the more active they are. And even hyper locally, you can see timing differences. It's because they don't all come out at once. It's essentially a bell curve of individual insects emerging, where you might have, like this year, we've seen some bugs starting to emerge as early as like the 22nd of April, but you'll have bugs in that same area. They're still coming out, the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th of May. So, and those bugs all have their own lifespan. So you could be in a fishing situation, you can be on a body of water where you have a pile of bugs early in the emergence, and late in the emergence, that might be one of the areas that dries up the soonest, the earliest. And so, you'll have those early ones die out first and the later ones die out last. And as a that adult lifespan is generally 3 to 4 weeks. And so if you have bugs emerging over the course of 2 weeks, then, you can expect to have some adults out for about 4 to 6 weeks. And, you can kind of try to play that to your advantage the best you can to prolong things.
Nice. Well, let's talk a little bit about fishing. I feel like a lot of this is kind of being in the right place at the right time. But once you're there, what kind of gear are you using? What's your setup? And I assume it varies a little bit based on species, but maybe you can talk about that a little bit too.
Yeah, I mean, so fishing generally is not that challenging. It's the the location aspects, the scouting that is the challenging part. Um and I mean, as far as gear, so I mean, I almost exclusively target common and grass carp during the periodical cicada emergencies. So I generally fish an 8 weight. Um I've used heavier rods, particularly for grass carp. Um I've used lighter rods for common carp and your bass and panfish and stuff like that. But I tend to fish an 8 weight for carp specifically, and it's also worth considering from a fly line standpoint. Um, I tend to go with tropical lines because generally speaking, it's hot and dry, and at least I'm generally in a boat in the middle of a lake, and a temperate or cool water line can can get kind of gummy and you're trying to accurately cast sometimes at distance. So um, my favorite lines the last several years have been the Scientific Angler's Bonefish line because it's a bright white, um, casts really well at distance accurately, and it's geared pretty warm, so you don't have any problems with failure there. Um, that Infinity Warm line, which I use a lot bug fishing for smallmouth, or have in the past year or so, is also a good one. So, tropical lines that you can carry a lot of in the air. So generally not really heavy-headed lines, that allow you to make long casts and, pick up a fly at distance and deliver it with accuracy, again, with minimal false casting is what I like to fish.
Nice. And are you typically using like 9-foot leaders?
Yeah, so I mean, honestly, I've more or less adapted my typical smallmouth leader, which is it starts at 9.5 feet. I mean, 8 or 9 feet would be perfect. But I go 9.5 just because it's, especially for technical low water smallmouth fishing, it's not a bad idea. And do I generally don't do long tippets. I like to do long butt sections. So that longer leader will start with like 5 feet of 50-pound monofilament or nylon. And that pretty stiff butt section just allows you to have pretty good turnover through that back half of your fly line or your leader. And you can taper it down, 40, 30, 25, 16, or 20 to 12 or whatever you need to do. And not be casting a lot of real limp, narrow diameter tippet trying to turn over a bug. So that's what I like to do. I have not been in a lot of situations, um, fishing warm water species where, um, that leader length has been an issue.
Hmm.
So, I generally wouldn't go any longer than that.
Nice. And are there any fly patterns you'd highlight or things that you look for in a fly pattern when you're going out and fishing this hatch?
Yeah. One thing one thing that I don't like is extended foam bodies, um, because they tend to get destroyed in nets. You'll hook a fish. You almost always hook a carp and the fly's still in, the hook is in their mouth, but the fly is kind of on the outside of their mouth. They get in the net and they stick this foam body in the net and just start rolling around and flopping. you know, Depending on how durable your fly is, you might get a couple fish out of it before it's falling apart. Um, and there's had some days where, you put up 50 plus fish, and you're just, you know, going through dozens of flies. So
It's
something
expensive.
it gets expensive, man. Something that's, and the good thing, the silver lining there is that generally when it's good, um, I've heard folks talk about how, the wings have to be tented, or the bug has to be upside down on the water or right side up or whatever. I like in the middle of one of those hatches, there are bugs upside down, sideways, right side up, one wings, two wings, no wings, and they eat them all. So, if your fly's getting destroyed, it's a good chance it's still going to eat it. It's not, they're looking for large black bugs on the surface. So to a degree, it doesn't matter that much, but nobody wants to fish with a fly that's falling apart if they can help it. So pretty durable flies. I I love um I love fishing cork bugs. I think there's a great time and place for them. They get a lot of attention when they hit the water. They float really well. Um, there's there are also times when that is not what fish want. So I always have a couple of different foam bugs too. Foam bugs just hit the water more softly And you will run into situations carp fishing where you will have, particularly grass carp, where you have fish that are grazing, where they're just kind of cruising and coming up and eating a bug and coming up and eating a bug. And they're not really going to move for one. A lot of times that's sort of peak emergence when you have a lot of bugs on the water. And more or less to be successful, you just have to put the fly in their path and, you know, hope that they come up and grab yours. And in that situation, a bug that hits the water, with some natural splat, but not real aggressively is generally the better way to go. So, vice versa, there are times when a denser cork bug works better. So I like to have both. Um, and foam bugs tied well are pretty durable. Cork bugs are really durable. Um, and then so I'll go ahead and burn this one fly pattern. The One of the sort of more commercially available ones is the Rainey's cicada.
Mhm.
Is not one of my favorites, largely because body's really durable, but they have really highly kind of angled wings that stick up at like a 45 to the body. Lots of deer or elk hair, with a fairly stiff body material. And carp are, they're naturally bottom feeders. Their mouths face downward. And so to eat something on the surface, they kind of have to line it up perfectly and pull their head and mouth up out of the water and on top of something. And they have a blind spot in front of their face because their eyes are on the side of their head. And they don't have great eyesight to begin with. And a lot of times I've found that they just kind of knock those bugs out of the way more than they do get them. Um, and so, that sort of really stiff kind of protruding wing up above the fly coming back at an angle, I think is a detractor. It's also not real dense. And I do think that bugs that are denser, they just are kind of anchored more solidly in the water, in the surface. They don't get, because you will, even in a perfect scenario, you'll have carp attempting to eat your fly. You'll see them do it with naturals too, where they come up and they try to put their mouth up over it and they come down and just, the bubble of air and water and everything, it just washes out of their mouth and they don't get it. And denser bugs, I think, mitigate that problem a little bit. They just don't move as easily um, when pushed. So I think you tend to hook fish better with those patterns.
Interesting. And last question on flies. Are you looking forward to trying out Blaine's new cicada wings this year?
Yeah, I've already messed with a bunch. You know, I I go back and forth on stuff like that. On the one hand, I mean, fly tying's fun. It's a big
Mhm.
part of it for me. They're super cool wings. Um, and I love being able to incorporate them into patterns. I don't necessarily think you need something realistic looking necessarily, but I tend to like to err on that side because, you know, there's no sense in having a fly pattern for when the fish are not picky and one for when they're picky, because who knows how well they'd eat the more realistic ones when they're not picky. So I just
Mhm.
I like to fish the best thing I can and see what happens. I have not had much of an issue, getting fish to eat flies like Blaine's original, um, you know, foam
Mhm.
cicada, the project cicada, which I think is a fully mill pattern. I like it has a durability issue though. Um, and then cork bugs and the one I've been fishing or been tying lately is sort of a marriage of Blaine's pattern and um another pattern that I've tied in the past.
Nice, nice. Um, well, I kind of wanted to walk through your guide season last year to help people develop, honestly, kind of an appreciation for how much effort can go into fishing this hatch and candidly what you do. Um, so, so maybe to kick it off, do you have an estimate for how many miles you drove last year to fish the hatch?
I do not. I do know that I
Or
did.
not to think about it?
Yeah, I do know that I did a conventional oil change and needed another one before it was all said and done. Um, I know that I was on 14 different lakes in about 3 days in 3 different states before I found really what I wanted. Um, some of that was, I had not fished the brood emergence last year before, and it was a tad misleading, and there were a couple of just interesting things that developed that I kind of had to react to. So I did all that. Landed on a location, fished it for about a week, and then ended up shifting locations again halfway through. Um, so, you know, a lot. I did it. I drove.
How comfortable are you in zeroing in on some more specific locations?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say generally, I've fished sort of the early portion of that hatch in the western half of North Carolina, um, which, according to the maps is sort of ground zero for that hatch, local, semi-local to us.
Mhm.
Um, the but never really found anywhere where they were super duper heavy and super duper widespread. And I never really found exactly the fishing I was looking for. Did find some really good fishing for a couple of days, but um, grass carp fishing was a whole nother thing. I mean, they tend to be less populous than common carp. They do get satiated, so you see a change in behavior as the hatch progresses and as those fish, feed on them, they change their behavior, and it can peter out fairly quickly, which is what happened. We had that a week of really good fishing, um, you know, of large, it's a lot of fun to sight fish a, 45 to 50-inch fish on the surface. Um, but it's just different. And then I ended up basically packing up shop and moving to another state after that. Just, again, because it wasn't happening. You only have so much time.
Mhm.
So you cannot just sit around and think, well, it's going to get better. It's going to, more going to show up, or like things are going to change, because, what you get, it's what you get. And, um, again, that's just where knowing what you're looking at and knowing how it's supposed to progress, and what it generally looks like, and just kind of relying on your instincts too, is really important.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think when we talked about this, last year in a lot more detail, I think the first thing I said to you was that you should charge a lot more for these trips.
I probably should, but yeah, well, that's a whole nother discussion.
You don't have to answer, but you put a lot of effort in. Well, maybe to build on that, to summarize or reemphasize, you're taking time out ahead of time, which means not doing trips, foregoing income on that to drive potentially crazy distances requiring multiple oil changes and spending money on gas. You're staying away from home because it's not going to happen necessarily where you live. And so you have higher costs associated with that. And then you're fishing a pretty unpredictable hatch. And you're also calling clients just a few days out or a few weeks out at best and kind of hoping they can come. Um, so don't let Allie listen to this, but why do you pursue this as a guide year in and year out? It seems like you're doing a little bit more than just trying to make a buck, you know?
That yeah, that's a great question. Speaking of Allie, so this makes a lot of people laugh. But 2021, so we got married June 12th of 2021, which was about 2 weeks after that hatch, the fishing associated with that hatch really started. Um,
So you were doing a lot of the planning.
I exactly. I was doing some planning. It just wasn't necessarily Wednesday. Um, yeah, and I mean, Allie's a bug nerd too, and she actually got to do some carp fishing with me. But um, yeah, we I kind of had a decision to make that year because we were getting married in early June, and I knew I only had so many days, and um, I knew I could go to East Tennessee, not too far away, and I also knew I could go to Northern Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, closer to where we were going to get married. And just thinking about the economy of days, I made the decision to go north. Um, and I packed up like 2 weeks before the wedding, and I took some of our good friends, Malcolm and Jim, cicada fishing like 2 days before we got married. Um, had a tree branch fall through my windshield on the last day in the boat ramp parking lot. Drove back down 95 to our rehearsal dinner with my head sticking out the window. So like she understands, thankfully. Um, but I mean that's kind of just it. I mean my my guiding business is as much of a lifestyle decision as it is uh vocational decision. And the whole point is to introduce people to things that I love about fishing, which generally means being well-rounded and targeting sort of this most special windows of opportunity for a variety of different species, because we live in the Southeast where you can fish for, you know, ton of different things at different points in the year. And I kind of design my year around that, where I really don't do one thing for more than a couple of months. And I generally try to focus on what's in its prime at any given time. Um, but as a business and as the primary income provider for our family, it's a huge risk that I take attempting to do this, and introduce my folks to periodical cicada fishing. But the part of me that the part of me that started a guide service, that is true to myself and that actually runs a business most of the time, wouldn't be able to sit around and just not be a part of something like that start to finish. And it's like I said, I'm a bug nerd. It checks all the boxes for me. It's one of my favorite things. And the fact that just about everyone that I've ever fished with during an emergence comes away with it with a top tier lifetime fishing memory makes it all worth it too. And that's kind of just what it's about, is the experiences and good people and being as authentic and fulfilled in what I'm doing as possible. Because anyone who's ever done it knows that you're not going to make a killing as a guide. So I don't see any reason to not do exactly what I want to do, you know,
Yeah.
and that's it's just a super cool opportunity that we have.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, in talking with you, it's interesting because I feel like to do this effectively, and specifically if you're going to guide it effectively, you need a really broad set of skills. You need to be able to do technical desk research. You need to be adventurous and go to new bodies of water and explore, areas that you may have never been before. And you need to be able to figure things out quickly, adapt quickly, and deal with uncertainty. Is there anything else that I missed that you think is important?
No, I think that's about it. That's
Good. I'm glad.
just a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
yeah, it's definitely a lot, but there's a lot of anxiety in my life this time of year when we've got something like this coming up. But I was talking to a friend of mine this morning about that. And it's like right now it feels that way, but I also know for a fact that I'm not going to remember any of that in less than a week,
Right.
because it'll be firing off probably in places I was expecting it to, and it'll be just pretty mindless and awesome for a couple of weeks. So which in itself is kind of nuts to think about all that effort for a couple of weeks, but
Yeah.
it's a bit of a testament too, I think.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know, the point of what we're talking about here is really not, I run a fly shop that's in Bluff City, Tennessee. This isn't an advertisement to come out and fish the Holston for the Cicada Hatch 2025. Really, it just seems like there's a lot of misunderstanding and misinformation out there. And I think both you and I are kind of recording this just to get a little bit more of information out and help people a little bit. Are there any resources we haven't talked about that you point people towards?
Um, Man, I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned Dave's book. I guess it's the only real like fishing related periodical cicada book out there. I'm sure there's something else somewhere, but it's too interesting of a thing. But the not that I'm aware of. Um, and then yeah, like I said, I mean, so much of it has nothing to do with fishing and everything to do with the bugs. So I I mean, as I would with all kinds of fishing, I would recommend people read up and learn about the bug before they read up and learn about the fishing.
Yeah, yeah. And again, to be clear on the geography and everything. So you live in Abington, you're about 30 minutes away from me. Um, Given that you're going to where you think the hatch is going to be best and things are going to set up best, are you going to be focusing most of your time, Matt, on the South Holston and Watauga, Tennessee tailwaters?
Zero of my thoughts.
That's kind of what I expected. Um, but based on my research, we'll have some cicadas within a reasonable distance from here. So if you're coming out to fish the Holston Watauga over the next month or so, do it to fish for big trout as you would any other year. Don't come with the expectation for cicadas on those rivers. But if you're local and you want to mix it up and drive an hour and experience something a little bit new that happens once every 17 years, I'd encourage you to look into this a little bit more. Um, Last question, Matt. You've had this hatch pretty dialed in for at least a few years now. Uh, Dave Zielinski's book came out last year, and now anyone who's willing to read, about 100 pages of a relatively small book with a lot of pictures, and look at a few maps can kind of figure this out and get dialed into at least a broad swath of places to go explore. If you had a time machine, would you go back and drown or seriously threaten Dave before the book's publication?
That's a really good question. Actually, I actually spoke to Dave earlier today. He has become an acquaintance of mine just through this whole thing. We actually ended up on the same bank fishing last year just by happenstance. Again, reading maps and theorizing and coming up with the game plan. Um, no, I would never thought about murdering anybody, so I wouldn't wouldn't do that. Um, but it like you're talking about, there is an insane amount of misinformation out there, um, and just really sort of lack of understanding. So I think it's an important resource. Um, but from the part of me that likes to be fairly quiet and secretive and protect the things that I have and have learned, I think it's if I do quite a bit of writing myself, and I always said if I were to write a book, it would be more of a sort of process level type book that has kind of touches on all the things that cicada fishing allows me to practice. You know, the understanding the environment, the food source, the fish, you know, the little intricacies within the environment, just how fisheries and energetics and all those things work. And I think that's, I mean, that's what fishing a periodical cicada emergence is to a large degree. So, you're not really, I would say Dave did not burn much, writing that book. You know, it's information that has been out there, and I think he made it really well accessible to the fly angler. So, I don't fault him at all for that.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, before we go, if someone wants to get on your short list for cicada trips, either this year or in the future, how do they do that?
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much what I do. I've got a page on my website devoted to that. More or less, I collect names, and just, you know, a week ago, I sent out an email to everybody on there, just keeping everybody updated on what's going on, what I'm seeing, where I'm going, what I'm expecting. And, you know, I'll have folks sort of give me a rough rundown of their schedule over the next month or so. So we can try to work people in where it works. But, um, you know, if you'd like to be in on that list, it's an indefinite list. So you'll be on there for all the hatches in the future. Just shoot me a note and just tell me you're interested in it. You can do that through my website, which is just mattreillyflyfishing.com. And yeah, just let me know. It's super exciting, and especially if you haven't seen it before. I love showing people what it is for the first time. So don't hesitate to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thanks a ton for the time, Matt. This has been really cool.
Yeah, man. You too.
All right. Thanks.
And how that fire's burning hot, but it can't keep up with your touch. So girl, come on.